presentation, High Street's presentation on when do you need a chart of accounts redesign. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The lines are muted. Please submit any questions that you have via the chat. Write them down. Don't forget them. We will have a full question and answer session at the end. Agenda for today, as you can see on the screen, introductions. We'll go over high-level profile of High Street IT. And then Kirsten Stone will get into the discussion of charts of accounts and when a chart of account redesign is needed. So for introductions, next slide. My name is Charles Stanback. Again, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm account executive at High Street IT. We will have Kirsten Stone doing the majority of the presentation. She is a consultant with over 15 years of experience, very knowledgeable, and you guys will get a lot of value out of this presentation today from Kirsten. A high-level overview of High Street IT. We are an Oracle Platinum Partner, extensive experience throughout many different verticals, not only the entire PeopleSoft stack, both financials, HCM, supply chain management, inventory management, but we have experience in upgrades, implementations throughout the nation over various projects. But the most specific thing that we like to discuss with our customers and our value proposition to our partners that we work with, we say we have consistent, reliable results every single time. And we do that by making sure that we have experienced consultants on each of our projects, consultants with real-world business experience that enable us to give some of that business value and experience back to our customers. Additionally, we're engaged and hands-on. Our executive team makes sure that the projects that we are tasked with partnering with our customers on are done in a reliable fashion. We use a flexible methodology to make sure that what we are implementing and what we are doing with our customers is contained in a way that, that our organization can be successful, not only for our customers, but our customers to have continued success with the applications and the consulting that we provide. With that, I am going to turn this over to Kirsten to begin. Again, if you guys have any questions, make sure that you put them in chat or wait till the end for our Q&A session. Kirsten?
Thank you, Charles. And I just want to emphasize to the audience, if anyone has difficulty hearing me, please just send in a question letting us know. I'm keeping my eye on the question board during our discussion, so that way I can know that I need to speak up, okay? So to get started then, we want to talk about what is the chart of accounts. And very simply, that is your structure of values that you use to code your financial transactions. And that's whether that is in your ERP system or non-PeopleSoft systems. For example, depending on your industry, you might have, say, a patient revenue billing system, you might have a grants awards tracking system, et cetera. So it's basically any system in which you're capturing that financial information. And what it does is it captures your journal entries and then the body of your data that becomes your financial analysis and reporting that you use to manage your business. So taking a step back for a moment, understanding the context of chart of accounts and why it is so central to your organization. As I was mentioning before, you have various infrastructure for your organization. You have your ERP systems, your revenue systems, billing systems, all of which represent your technology that you use to run and manage your business. And on top of that, of course, there's a whole layer of financial language that you use to run your organization. Common terminology that might be unique to your specific company, industry-specific standards, maybe some regulatory requirement language that you use whenever you're discussing your financial information and how you're performing. And that's important to keep in mind because as you're going into your chart of accounts design, you have to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of that common financial language. If they're not, if there are some inconsistencies, especially when you're talking, I found that it's true, whenever you're talking about cost centers versus departments versus divisions, oftentimes different people might have different perceptions within the same organization, and it's really important to get on the same page what terminology is referring to what concepts financially. And then on top of that, of course, you have your actual technical, physical charting of your accounts, your coding that you actually put on your financial transactions in your organization. Now, the reason to mention all of that in that order then is because that's ultimately what will drive what your operations management has to deal with in their various systems, whether it's cash management, asset management, your accounting group, of course. Their focus is that they want to create a single version of the truth when they're doing their financial reporting. You have your general ledger, your budgeting, your forecasting, and then finally you have your general maintenance and communication. And hopefully your organization might even have a data governance group that marshals and owns the quality of the data across your various systems to make sure it's consistently represented. And so by working on your chart of accounts, you're going to affect all of those things. Ultimately, that'll result in affecting your processing efficiency, your actionable financial information, and it improves the quality of your data. So it's very wide and broad in terms of the impact to your organization, and that's why chart of accounts is so significant. So what do you want to do a chart of accounts redesign? When is the good time to do that? Well, basically the answer is anytime. It depends on what you're doing in your organization. So for example, if you're going to have to do a conversion of data, perhaps you're upgrading your ERP system, or perhaps you're changing one of your critical path subsystems, like your revenue system, such that it's going to change a restriction. Maybe previously that subsystem could not deal with longer than a 6-digit project code, and now it can accommodate a 15-digit project code. And previously you had various issues and limitations in your financial system because you had to accommodate this requirement of this other system. And now, because you're changing that other system, you have an opportunity to use longer digits, maybe a 12-digit project ID in your PeopleSoft or other ERP system. And so then you recognize that, well, now's a good time to do a conversion of data, to modify our chart of account structure, because it's definitely important to realize that it's a very significant cost to your organization anytime you're doing a conversion of data. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the bang for your buck. So if you're having to do a conversion because of, say, new regulatory reporting requirements, and you're going to have to invest those hours and those resources in validating that converted data, then that's a good time to build in enough of a review of your chart of accounts that you're going to maximize that benefit fully by realigning your chart of accounts, if that's what your organization needs. Another indicator that you might want to consider doing a redesign on your chart of accounts is whether or not you're having issues with how your chart of accounts are defined or used in your organization. So for example, you want to make sure, are your chart fields defined consistently? If they are not defined consistently between your various subsystems, then that's an issue that maybe you need to address. Or, for example, if your current chart fields are used for multiple purposes, like for example, the depth ID chart field. Oftentimes that gets misused and abused for different purposes. Sometimes they're used for a department concept, but sometimes they also get used for a program concept or a project concept, depending on the needs of your organization. And so it's important to think about, if you have that situation occurring, maybe now's the right time to go ahead and change that. Another favorite of mine is the free text field. Some organizations create a free text field which basically collects, it's like a junk drawer. It just collects random pieces of information that various end users in the community, usually managers, want to collect because they want to create certain kinds of reports, usually for something very specific to their area. And so again, if you have that kind of activity going on, that might be an important indicator that you need to redefine how your chart of accounts are being used. Or perhaps you have the situation where you're not able to really get a control around the quality of the combination of your chart field values. So for example, your combination edits, maybe you constantly have to do financial reclasses because you have incorrect combinations of account and department. Some organizations are not allowed to have For example, meals expense charged to certain project IDs. And so if you are finding that that is happening in your data and that you're having to do corrections manually to fix that, then that can be a good indicator that you need better controls around the use of your chart fields. Or simply onboarding new resources. If it's very difficult to get them educated and up to speed in how to code financial transactions, for example, if you have accounts payable end users that are faced with a lot of accounting information that they have to learn in order to properly code vouchers or requisitions, then you need to consider maybe simplifying that coding. And then finally, another very important area to consider, a big indicator that you need to do a redesign is if you have reporting problems. And most organizations do struggle with that constantly. So for example, if you have reports and queries where you have to go through a layer of logic to get to a specific output, and so you have to think, well, this is true in this case, but not in that case, so you have to refilter the data. You maybe extract a certain grouping of accounts and projects and departments, but then you have to filter again to take out other types of transactions, and ultimately it takes a lot of steps in the process to get to the reportable data. That's a definite indicator that you want to do some realignment. If you have feeds between other systems that go through a similar exercise of multiple iterations to get to the data so that it can then be imported into your system, that can be an issue because that means there's a disconnect between what the data is coded as in your subsystem versus in your main financial system. And you also want to think about querying the data. If you're on PeopleSoft currently and you have end users querying your data, but you notice that they have a tendency to just pull it into Excel and manipulate it and change it and transform it, and that's a key word. If they're adding information to that data before they can then report on it, that information is not going into your financial system. So that's an important indicator that you might want to consider realigning your chart of accounts. So that way you're gathering as much of the appropriate information on your financials as possible. Another classic is when it's difficult to get to the concept of legal entity and the concept of management level information in the same ERP system. That can be a definite indicator that you have an issue. Or when there's problems producing your regulatory reporting from your current chart of accounts. Or if you can't get the information out of your current system because you often hear a lot of qualifiers saying, well, it depends. If you can't get a straight answer on extracting the data from your system, then that can be a sign that you have problems. Okay, so now we've talked about ways that you can recognize that there is a problem. Let's talk about how to solve the problem. So this is a very content-rich slide, and it has a lot of information about the whole process for chart of accounts design that we perform at High Street. But it's really very simple. It's really all about communication. So in the first phase, vision, what you want to make sure is that you're getting the right participants in your chart of accounts design process. You would have what I call your core team members. They're the ones that will do the majority of the decision making. And then you also have important resources outside of that immediate core. They would be considered to be key influencers. So they're people that you want to make sure you vet your design decisions with, but you don't want them in fact making those decisions. And you want to make sure that as you gather these people together and get them to commit the time to the chart of accounts design effort and the work involved, that you then also get a sense of consensus. So there's communication that we do where we educate, get on the same page in terms of the common financial language that we mentioned earlier, make sure everyone understands what the goals are, what the outputs are for this effort. And one of the most important things that we talk about and we establish with that group is we decide what will be our guiding principles for the chart of accounts design for this project. And we want to make sure that everyone has a mutual understanding and agreement what are going to be the parameters. And we're going to look at some generally regarded guiding principles in a little while, and you'll see what kind of content that is. But it's basically what do you envision as the direction you want to go. So then we move on to our second phase, which is the chart structure straw model. And basically through education again, we talk about what delivered PeopleSoft fields are, how they're typically used. we start talking about examples in the organization. There's a lot of discussions about different types of situations and struggles and issues, and we really want to visit those issues and those pain points so that we address them. And then we pretty quickly start to formulate, so what do we think the fields are that we want to use and how we want to use them? We create that straw model. We also want to start discussing them with some of our key influencers as well to vet it with them, see what their feedback is on that initial draft. And that's the important thing to understand. It's a draft. Because there's still two more very important phases we go through regarding that straw model. So the next thing we want to do is we call it the financial information model. But basically what we're doing is we're coming up with more examples. So now we're defining, so what is our chart field naming and numbering convention? We come up with some example values and how they map to the original set of values in your current system. We actually drop some debits and credits. We talk about and illustrate what are some of the key critical reporting issues that we've run into that we think we've solved. So we often end up working in Excel with a lot of filtering and pivot tables. So that way we start to see how the data actually looks and feels and what our different options are, and have we really created a model that's working for us. We also start planning for what we call proof of concept. Now, proof of concept is all about time and resources and volume of data that you want to transform, just like a mini project in and of itself. And some organizations, let's say it's an upgrade for PeopleSoft that has initiated this whole interest in a chart of accounts redesign process. So then what we would do is we would talk about, so do we have, say, a 9.2 demo environment available? Do we have the time and the resources to commit to going ahead and loading these example chart field values, example debits and credits, and do basically a manual mini conversion? And I want to emphasize that because accountants love their debits and credits and their data, and they often enthusiastically kind of get carried away and want to bite off more than they can chew. You're not going to do an actual financial conversion because usually there's not the option of having enough hours in the day to go ahead and validate all that data. But you want to go for what's the most critical sample set that you can get to. So example, revenue and expense. So you can do little pieces of a P&L, maybe some areas in the balance sheet if you're considering changes that would affect your capital tracking. And then you decide and agree upon as a team how far you're going to go. Are you going to actually put it in a demo environment? Are you going to stay with Excel and just do some more examples? And sometimes that's sufficient. But the key here is as they're going to be working the proof of concept, you want your team participants to get really confident in what the structure is and how it's supposed to function. So then in the proof of concept itself, I apologize about that. So in the actual proof of concept itself, your end users are going to start to load that data in, maybe run some vision reports, depending on the skill sets of the resources involved. They may run the data in and then query it out and then pivot it. And the idea is that way they are getting their visual examples that they need, that they've in fact resolved, resolved problems. Okay. Now after you've done that proof of concept effort, whatever it might have been defined as, then you want to gather more of your end users. Not all of them, but another set of users beyond your key influencers to review what you've done. This can also be an opportunity to start your training efforts, educating your resources, plan how you're going to roll out this chart of accounts change. And you're going to get some, inevitably, additional feedback, which is fine, because then you can incorporate that into your model. They may think of some handy additional visual identifiers you haven't discussed, whatever that may be, and then you can incorporate it and finalize your design, which is ultimately the final step. So here are the considerations that a team will consider when they're formed. They're going to think about, very simply, reporting needs, regulatory requirements, your accounting requirements. They also want to have a focus on operational needs and also their budgeting and planning requirements. Other factors that have to be considered, you want to think about who owns the transaction, which legal entity, which management unit. You want to understand things like where did the transaction come from, which subsystem. When it comes to budgeting questions, you want to think about, are we going to be budgeting at the actuals level or at a more summarized level? PeopleSoft has the capability of adding budget-only purpose chart field values. And so are you going to use that functionality? Now granted, this is not an implementation phase. This is a chart of accounts design effort. But if you are doing it as part of an impending ERP implementation, there are some pieces of the implementation you need to consider upfront as part of your chart of accounts design. Because if you are going to be budgeting at a summary level in PeopleSoft and using that chart field value functionality, you'll need to know that as you go ahead and define what those values are, create your new outlines for your new trees, and that will all be much more efficient and productive for you. Of course, you also need to think about what are the impacts to the other systems. So for example, are you going to be tracking projects? Are you going to actually be using project costing? Those kinds of key decisions should also be made as you're making your baseline chart of accounts structure decisions. You also want to think about what are the impacts to any of your other subsystems. Do you have any unique data security requirements? And it's very important that that comes later on in your consideration because the first thing you need to attend to is creating a design that functions for you. And then after you have that design, then you want to think about, now how do we need to secure it? So it is an important thought, but it must come later on in the process. PeopleSoft has many security options, and so it's important not to create a design based on what your security requirements are. And most importantly, you just want to think about, does this new solution actively solve the problems that are being experienced today? So let's take a moment then and look at some of the tools. So these are those leading practices. You can also look at these as guiding principles. And so it's important to review these lists and then think through, are they going to work for your organization? Some organizations have to add some unique initial directives they've been given in addition to these. So you would just start off in the position of thinking through, from a guiding principle perspective, can you commit to each chart field will have one meaning? So in other words, your business unit, your operating unit, your account, your line of business, your department. Will it be consistently used for that purpose alone? As I mentioned before, I've often found that department gets disabused and it is used for department purposes, program purposes. Some organizations have a hard time defining when does that change happen, when does a department at some point transition to being a product or a project. Next, we have each chart field is available to be used in conjunction with each of the other chart fields. Now, as I mentioned before, PeopleSoft has that functionality of combination editing that allows you to define chart field to chart field relationships and even specify which value combinations are acceptable and which are not. So it's important to go over those basics with that core team, make sure the whole core team understands how that functionality works. Because as they're making their decisions about the different chart fields, they will always think of situations where there are combinations they never want to see and there are combinations they definitely do want to see. By working with their combination edits and planning for that, you can end up with the right infrastructure to support the design. Next, the information that has to be maintained in a chart field must be well-defined, understood, and documented. So you're going to make a commitment to how this is going to be used, and you're going to document that in a very education-friendly way and distribute that to your resources and be in agreement on that content. Logic within your chart field numbering should be avoided. Now, this is a fun area because I've often had clients push back, quite honestly. They're used to giving your managers, for example, ranges of departments that are quote-unquote theirs and that they get to decide what the numbering will be within that range. And the reason why this needs to be avoided is it includes many particular points. So one reason is you don't want to limit your numbering, because if you're going to grow past a certain point, especially if departments not consistently being used, you might have a manager who quickly runs through their range, and then they're out of numbers. And then what are you going to do? Usually you end up repurposing other department IDs, and then there's confusion when you go to convert data and what a particular department number is really referencing. So that can create a whole number of issues in and of itself. Another reason that you don't want to have logic in your chart field numbering is because sometimes there's reorganization. Again, the department chart field in particular, you often end up with a reorg in your organization. So you could start off with a range that has a significant meaning, and within 2 years, it's completely outdated because now half of that department structure has to roll up under a different area, and any meaning you created in your numbering is lost. A resource that I work with often, great project manager and chart field designer, he's often said, you were not born with a specific depth ID assigned to you. So you really need to let go of that attachment. And people often think that's an interesting comment to make, but then when you see how people really do get put off by having to accept that change, so needless to say, change management or helping resources absorb these changes can be more than half the challenge in this effort. Another leading practice is naming standards. Some organizations maybe aren't so effective at consistently naming and numbering their chart fields. They might want to do a mix of alphanumeric. They might want to consider what would be better visually for people who are coding transactions. For example, on requisitions, what would make more sense? So your chart field length should be established to be large enough to allow room for growth and prevent the recycling of values. An exception to the rule of logic in numbering is the natural account. And I just want to take a moment to point that out because that is a classic structure for a reason. It is universal to accounting systems. And so the account numbers that start with 1 are assets, 2 are liabilities, et cetera. So you want to make sure that those number ranges you assign for assets, various sections of your balance sheet, that range is large enough that you can continue to grow in that area. And then finally, your chart of account structure needs to be defined prior to your security discussion. As I was mentioning before, security should be discussed, but it must come at the end of the process after you've already pretty well defined your design and you're committed to it. Then you find a way to secure it. So some more of the general principles that you want to think about is when it comes to things being balanced, you want to think about what kind of structure do we want to create, but what can end users realistically code? And you have to achieve that balance. Otherwise, you might end up with garbage in, garbage out. If people are putting in a 35, 40 character numeric, alphanumeric combination for every single transaction, they may lose an understanding of how to actually do the coding. If you don't have combination edits in place to help enforce the quality of your data, you may end up with inappropriate coding and unfortunately can end up with junky data, garbagey data. And so you want to avoid that. You want to find a balance that works for your organization and your resources. You also want to make sure that your design is expandable and flexible. As I've mentioned a few times already now, you want to make sure that you can grow with the design that you end up committing to. You want to think about what is the realistic life expectancy of your chart of accounts. So that way, if you know, for example, that, well, realistically, change is fairly constant in your organization, 5, 10 years, that would be the normal life. I've been in organizations where, quite honestly, they don't anticipate changing for 20 years. So you have to make sure that you've got something that can grow and thrive for that length of time. You have to think through more carefully. You want to make sure you create a chart of account structure that can be shared. So you want to think about what's the set of values for each chart field that can work for all components of your business. You also want to make sure that you think about being independent. So each chart field would act independently on its own. So for example, you might have a department for IT, and the real question would be is, are you collecting your IT costs so that you see what they are across your entire organization? You may have many legal entities, many business units, many locations, but is that IT department that supports all of that able to see what their costs are across the entire organization? That's the ability to allow each chart field to be independent. That's an example of that. You also want to think about, is your structure forward-looking? So an important key there is sometimes you have a limitation or an issue that you need to work around, but you really want to avoid a temporary fix because then it can often become your permanent solution, especially if you have to make this chart of accounts last for a long time. So as an example, you might want to consider if you're dealing with a restriction that's being imposed by a subsystem, then take the time to consider, is it worthwhile to get that subsystem addressed and fixed, or can we address the issue through a mapping so that way we don't have to let it affect our chart of account structure and the rest of our systems. And finally, you want to make sure that your COA is going to be usable. So you want to make sure that you have balanced segment sizes, that you are alternating your alphanumeric with your numeric fields. You want to make sure that you think about the positioning of each field, how it lines up with the most frequently used fields. So for example, accounts are required on all transactions, so you might want to make sure accounts are listed sooner in your chart of account structure than, say, projects, because maybe you have many transactions that don't require projects. So even more general design principles that you want to consider. You want to, of course, create a design that improves your core business processes. So you want to think of things that are, you want to think of aligning efficiencies. You want to make sure that you are meeting objectives in your organization, creating visibility in your reports. You want to make sure that you're supporting your enterprise integration. So again, it's very important to consider limitations and issues in those subsystems and address them properly. You want to make sure you're maximizing your software capability with minimal modification. Sometimes doing less is more. So you do want to make sure that you are considering that as well. You also want to talk about factoring in the maintenance and ease of use. So again, you don't want to put upon your end user community keying in an unreasonably long string of data for every single transaction if it's going to undermine the ultimate quality of your data. Now, leave data in the submodule. This is when people often talk about a fat ledger versus a skinny ledger. Some organizations have, for example, a data warehouse. So all the detail from all subsystems and financial go into that data warehouse, and they can get comprehensive reporting out of there. That's terrific. When that's the case, then you absolutely have no reason to bring a lot of detail from your subsystems into your general ledger. If you do, that's why they call the general ledger fat, because it has a lot of detail, a lot of dimensions of data in it. It's more efficient and makes more sense that you should only have the dimensions in your financial system that make sense for your financial reports and the sub-reports that are required. Now, you want to make sure when it comes to use of trees and attributes, you want to, again, get an understanding of PeopleSoft functionality. Attributes can be additional reporting details that are very important and helpful that you can add to your chart field values. So, for example, you can have a department manager can be associated with a department. Some organizations find that burden of maintenance to be too much. They have departments changing all the time, and who manages them changes all the time, so they don't want to put that layer in there. Other organizations, it's a perfect fit, and they find it very helpful. You can also roll up departments into trees. You can create roll-up structures using the tree functionality in PeopleSoft. You also want to think through all of the trees. You should have at least one tree per chart field that you create. When it comes to your reporting, you want to make sure that your chart of accounts accurately represents your financial reporting and enables that reporting to be very efficient and productive. and easily produced out of your system, or if you are using a data warehouse or Hyperion, that you're able to successfully export to those reporting tools accordingly. So now let's talk a little bit more about the proof of concept. I kind of wanted to get into that because I think oftentimes people just don't appreciate what it really could be and what an opportunity that is. I always like to tell the accountants, a proof of concept is like a little mini conversion, but then I always emphasize pull the reins when you're working on it because it's very easy to commit too much time and resources because what you end up doing is you create too many examples of data that you want to see mapped and you want to see example numbers for. So within a reasonable framework, you want to think about, well, what's a specific problem that you've had in the accounting area and the reporting area that you can address? Then you have your list of problems. Those become scenarios or use cases. Then you identify, well, what's the solution that we have in our chart of account structure that would address that? And then you want to think about, all right, so how can I visually display that? Is it loading a sample set of chart field values in the system and then some debits and credits and then producing an envision? That's a lot of time and effort. Or is it just simply putting that data, lining up the debits and credits in an Excel file, and then making sure I have description fields so that way I can just filter the data and get a sense of how the reporting could look that way. You want to make sure that you limit the size of the data, as I mentioned before. Sometimes you can mock certain amounts of the data, like maybe a beginning balance for a specific account, but not a full set of beginning balances. That usually tends to be far more than what people can really manage. You want to make sure you're keeping careful track of the mapping that you're establishing during this proof of concept effort, because that's valuable information, and that can be the springboard for creating your eventual full set of chart field values and mapping for those chart field values that you would then use to convert your full sets of data. You also want to make sure that you are all in agreement in terms of, so what's that visual effect or output that you want to see to guarantee that you have achieved your goal in your design solution that you were trying to address. So here's some samples of some output. So for a sample chart of account structure, this could be considered a straw model. And as you can see, left to right, the first thing we decide is how many characters, and are they alphanumeric, will each chart field be? And then we say, all right, so what's the name of the chart field? Now, what we choose to name it in an organization may not line up with what PeopleSoft calls that field, and it's important to make that distinction. So here, you can see the company this represents, they decided to call it cost center, even though in PeopleSoft they call it department. And that's fine, but this is a good visual to give your end users, because if they have been calling it department and now they're changing the cost center, it can help them make that transition. Where you see region in the yellow, the beginning of the yellow section, that is a case where they had decided to use a generic chart field, one of the 3 delivered generic chart fields PeopleSoft offers, and they needed to produce a concept called region, and so they used that for chart field 1. So again, this can be a helpful reference so that people who are familiar with PeopleSoft know, oh, that's the generic chart field. And then as you can see, they alternated the numbering and naming conventions for each field, and that provides them with a visual cue. So that way, if your business unit is 4 alpha followed by 6 numeric for account, then the cost center is 4 numeric. And so the benefit of that is you're less likely to make an error as an end user coding if you get used to seeing 4 alpha, then 6 numeric for the account, then 4 numeric for the cost center. Anytime you see a 4 number code, you know, oh, that's the cost center. When you see a 6 numeric code, you know, oh, that's an account code. Another thing I'd like to point out in this design is they also activated affiliate. So that tells me, as a PeopleSoft user, they had business unit as a balancing chart field. They're using do-to-do-from processing automatically in PeopleSoft. And so the affiliate value will always automatically get coded whenever I have 2 or more business units in a transaction. The affiliate information will automatically populate. And so as you can tell by the key at the bottom, then that field would be derived information. The fields region, product, and project, those are conditional. So an end user won't always code those fields. It depends. They might code it if it's appropriate, if it requires it. And then, of course, the required fields are the beginning fields. So as we mentioned before, the most frequently used fields are listed first, followed by the conditional fields, and then we put the derived fields last. And this is a consistent way of organizing and displaying your chart of accounts design structure that I have seen for as many years as I've been doing this, actually. The proof of concept itself, so again, I was mentioning that, so the first thing you want to think about is what your fields are, and as you can see, we've created columns over to the right, and then in the left-hand column, we decided that we just wanted to put descriptions of the different use cases that we were going to create, so that way we could get a quick visual through the little checkboxes to make sure that we have an example transaction for every field. And as you can see, the only field here that doesn't have an example transaction right now in this little snapshot you see is site. And they had a field they decided to call site, and it's not identified in any transaction right now. So as part of building my proof of concept, I'd want to make sure, well, what would be an example of a transaction where we would use the field site? It's probably a conditional field. And so we would talk through, oh, that would be, and then they would give an example, whatever that might entail. And so we would go ahead then and create, okay, so here's a typical journal that would actually have to have the site indicated on it. And then we know that we would make sure we have example site values identified. And then we would do our debits and our credits, clearly identifying when it's appropriate to use that as an illustration. And so as far as output goes, for this example, we had a client that actually wanted to create a drill down on some financial data where they could then see the program and fund details broken out. And so they were able to do a drill and then see the breakout of the various types of funds and what the dollars were across the different types of funds. And so we had actually produced this out of a demo copy after we loaded our chart field values. And instead of, like Fund 1, Fund 2, Fund 3, it did have a form name that they could see in the system, and it appeared on the report. I just took it out here because it was confidential information. But it gives you a feel for the type of visual. And then, of course, you want to do your write-up, your formal write-up of your proof of concept, just kind of, again, it's very helpful for training materials later on because it summarizes what the different use cases were, gives visual examples through either reports or pivot tables that clearly demonstrate what the intention is behind the use of each of those chart fields and example values. And it can be the springboard for a lot of different efforts, not just education of your end users, but also for your data conversion resources, so that way they have a clear understanding as to what the intention was. And then it makes each of your chart of accounts team members subject matter experts on what they've just done, and they're able to stand up and speak to what they have created. Here's an example of the mapping, and so it's simply taking your legacy values on the left. So in this case, it was a previous system had a segment that was a natural account concept, and then we just show what people thought the count that maps to on the right. And then these maps for each chart field became a core piece of the conversion program. So when it comes to the final observations, just want to be clear, nothing is forever, change is constant. So you want to make a design that is an improvement, but you also have to be mindful of the fact that it has to be flexible enough to get you to the next occasion for doing a redesign. You also want to make sure that you're looking to where the issues are because if your organization is having discussions about various reporting issues, when that comes to surface, then you realize that could indicate a chart of account structure issue. When you are doing a chart of accounts design, one of the biggest risks is having participants that keep insisting, but we've always done it this way. It's very hard to break down that resistance to change by giving people, though, the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process, by giving them the education they need to understand what are the options within the framework of your ERP system. That can often help them make that leap to being willing to make those changes themselves. And then you want to make sure that your chart of accounts redesign, that you're actually looking at the foundation of your accounting structure, and you want to make sure that all the people participating in that effort understand that the significance of that moment. It needs leadership recognition. So the payoff, of course, is that you'll have, hopefully, you will achieve greater simplicity in your coding, which would reduce human error. You want to make sure that you're reducing the complexity and the if, then, else, when kind of circumstances that can surround data, that you're simplifying and streamlining it, and that you're definitely making sure it's reflective of the overall goals of your organization. I apologize for all my coughing today. It is allergy season, so I appreciate your patience. And I just wanted to make sure, as Charles mentioned, here's his contact information. And I do want to invite you to feel free to ask me questions. I'm not seeing anything on the board right now, so I'll give you a couple moments in case any of you want to throw out, is there a particular area of the design effort, if you want to ask me more detailed questions about what I've seen that's worked well for clients, happy to talk about it.
Well, I have a quick question for you. Just based on, and first of all, thank you for that presentation. But based on prioritizing different projects that, many organizations see, can you talk maybe or just summarize the business benefit or the business value of prioritizing a chart of accounts redesign project versus the other projects that are there?
Absolutely. I can tell you from experience, I've had clients that time and again say that it's night and day when they've done a chart of accounts redesign. The quality of, it's not just about the quality of data, it's also the significance of having that core team of your chart of accounts design, getting that group of people on the same page and comfortable with the coding does tremendous improvements for the organization as a whole. A lot of organizations don't really take that time to do that, and when they do, and I've often done this, hooked on to an ERP implementation. It's just we start off the first couple of months of the ERP getting the chart of accounts design going, and that gets everyone on the same page, and it just makes the work far more efficient for the rest of the ERP implementation as well, because you have a core group of financial people that can speak to what the new structure is and how it's to be used, and they get to initiate a lot of efficiencies in their business processes as well that are related to that.
All right. Thank you very much.
And I do want to mention, I did see that somebody asked if the presentation is going to be available for download, and yes, it will be. We're going to be sending out that link on Monday. And anybody else? Does anybody want to understand better, who would participate? I mean, I can definitely tell you that. Oh, yes?
And again, the lines are open, participants. So if you have any questions, feel free. Yeah, so feel free to chat.
There's forms available. Actually.
Okay, well, I do hear some folks are working, multitasking while they're watching this, and that's great.
Good, for the chart of accounts.
I guess I will say, when it comes to participants in the chart of accounts design, you definitely want to enlist members from your core GL team, of course, but you also want to make sure you include people from your budgeting and planning areas. You want to make sure that you have people from asset management, some supply chain representatives from purchasing, accounts payable. You want to have a nice cross-section of people that have to deal with financial data, cash management, treasury. By including a nice cross-set of resources, you'll get that insight you need into what the different issues are within your organization. Okay. Always feel free to email us questions too. If you think of questions after the fact that you'd like addressed, we are happy to do that as well.